Visible audience, thank you for coming to this. I am flattered and honored to be invited to do this. I am primarily a geologist, insofar as you could call me a geologist at all, based on that background talk you just heard. And I am not a geophysicist. So I'm going to be talking about how to bring a bunch of cool geological and physical data into the realm of geophysics in a way that I hope that you guys all find really interesting and really useful. But I am not going to be able to get that far with the geophysical intricacies of some of the stuff I'm going to be presenting with you, because my involvement in seismic anisotropy, specifically in the crust, was very much a partnered interaction with a really good geophysicist. And I would explain to her, what the microstructures meant and like how I was making the measurements, and she would explain the tensors, and it would I'd be like, okay, well, I guess that sounds plausible. So anyways, I'm going to be coming from that perspective. And feel free to ask me any questions you like at the end of the talk, but know that I'm not going to have a super good answer if it's going to be a really geophysical question. So, getting started, the whole talk here is about linking ductile microstructures, not brittle ones, ductile ones, to bulk seismic anisotropy. And so by bulk, we'll talk about that, but I mean essentially upscaling it to almost whatever scale you want and that you think is valid. And so ductility is a really good target for this sort of study and this sort of upscaling, because ductile processes in the earth do a really good job of homogenizing textures and crystal orientations, which are really important. So here's a little roadmap so that you know when to go get coffee and when to come back. First thing, we're going to do a broad overview of seismic anisotropy in general and why it's cool. And then we'll have a look at our natural laboratory that we use to illustrate seismic anisotropy and the pros and cons of different approaches and different caveats and interesting things to think about when you think about seismic anisotropy of natural structures. Then we'll cover how we make any of these measurements at all, which is definitely something I might go a little too technical on, because that is my job now, after all, to be a nerd about how to measure things. And then we'll talk about the actual results and how we arrive at a kilometer scale estimation of the elasticity tensor for like a whole ductile structure. And then we can talk briefly about why that is confusing and why the results are surprising. And maybe it's not so surprising if you're not a naive PhD student approaching a project like this. So seismic anisotropy is a really, really cool property because it allows you to basically image active and relic ductile structures deep, deep in the earth. And I'll give you some examples of this. But essentially, the seismic anisotropy relies on the fact that minerals are mostly naturally quite anisotropic in their elastic properties. Think about like a biotite crystal, for example, right? We've all seen those, it's like super platy. And it may not be that surprising if you think about bouncing a sound wave through it along the sheet structure. It's probably going to go pretty fast, especially compared to trying to bounce a sound wave across a layered sheet structure. There's all those gaps. And so the speed of sound is much slower going this way across a biotite crystal than it is going this way. And that's true for basically all the minerals that aren't cubic, even though the cubic ones have like a little bit of that going on too, which has to do with like all the complicated stuff with like crystal symmetry and rotations and that sort of stuff that we are not going to talk about in this talk. But what you're saying, what this whole principle is that minerals are isotropic. And so processes that align minerals will produce a larger scale anisotropy that should be visible by certain techniques. And this is cool because it's active and relic structures. Normally active structures, you just look for the earthquakes and that's kind of all you got. But in this case, you could go find like a suture zone that's floating around somewhere, in like the middle of the continent, if it created this sort of anisotropy. And so here's a simple example of mineral anisotropy, which is just an AB olivine fabric. And you can see that there's the Miller indices showing you the different orientations of the A, B, and C direction. There's going to be a lot of Miller indices in this talk. None of them mean anything, and I don't want you to think about them or even read them if you're not fluent in Miller indices, because they'll just be distracting. And instead, it's just a way of showing crystal orientations. And it's a way for you to have faith that I actually measured something when I start showing you my data. But in this case, what you see here on the left side is the orientations of the A, B, C axes of like a bunch of olivine crystals that have all been sheared in a certain way under certain conditions. And they have definitely aligned in such a way that you see like the high concentrations of the red. There's proportionally more crystal axes pointing in those directions based on the reference frame of the screen. which you can assume is like a thin section or something, or the side of a rock. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the resulting calculation for VP anisotropy. And in this case, it's pretty high. 6.8% is like a decently high number in the VP anisotropy world that I know about. And it's really cool. It's a cool example because you can see that the 100, is probably the fast axis in olivine, because the way that all of those axes are pointing like this on the screen is the same place where the VP is faster. And then there's a sort of a band like this, sort of going through from the reference frame of the page here, of the 010 that seems to be slow. And so even without knowing any of the intrinsic properties of an olivine crystal, you could look at this result and be like, oh, you know, the 100 direction is fast. And so if there's some sort of process that gets all of those 100 axes pointing the same direction, the bulk anisotropy is going to follow from that, that there's going to be a fast axis going aligned with the 100. And you can see how maybe a little inkling here of how this gets quite complicated when you have minerals of lower symmetry than olivine, and you have much more confusing interactions between various fast directions and sort of middling fast directions. And we'll get into all of that. But that's a nice little simple example. A more complicated example, but a little more inspiring and more relevant to what I'm going to show you now, is imaging of an actual ductile structure. And I guess it's like a little bit of a debate whether or not this is a ductile structure because it's active, and so that means it's at depth currently. And we don't know. It hasn't been cored as far as I know. But this is the main Himalayan thrust in India. And this is a really cool paper by Vera Schulte-Pelcom, who was my advisor and the fellow researcher in a lot of the stuff that I'm going to show you here. And she wrote this really cool paper in 2005 saying that it seemed like she could image a ductile shear zone starting where seismicity dropped off along the main frontal thrust here. And so that is essentially what she's marked out here. And again, if you ask me any questions about what that means or the caveats of red versus blue here, I'm not going to have any idea. But the idea here is that by looking at the anisotropy of waves traveling up through the crust, where you know that there's some sort of structure and there's a likely ductile structure, it turns out that there is some evidence for actually thinking that you're able to see that ductile structure. And so when you zoom in here on this little spot that they talk about in the paper, you get this cool little schematic diagram also from that paper illustrating what they think explains the sort of anisotropy that they measured from the surface from waves passing through. And what it looks like is if you assume that there's some sort of shear zone with kinematics that makes sense, in this case, you know, like a thrust. And if you assume that that shear zone has a certain mineralogy, which is a pretty easy thing to assume most of the time, like there's lots of minerals that are pretty common at different depths and different conditions in the earth. And then you assume that they've all been aligned a certain way that makes sense based on other known sort of microstructural relationships with bulk shear like that. It turns out that you can explain the anisotropy that they see at the surface with a roughly 6 kilometer thick zone with about a 20% anisotropy overall. And so there's more detail in this figure here about like it requires like a slow axis sort of at this orientation and then a fast axis at this orientation. And the fact that they're orthogonal is nice because that sort of suggests the presence of phyllosilicates like muscovite, biotite, chlorite, all of which are reasonable things to infer exist at these pressures and temperature conditions, and like the general sort of knowledge we have of deformation history in this area, as opposed to, you know, like an amphibole, you know, or a pyroxene or some other mineral where, you know, the fast might go this way, but then the slow might be more of like a ring shape, you know, and less of a fast plane slow direction, which is what they saw here. So it's a cool example of making an actual measurement of a place where you suspected there to be a ductile structure, and it turns out you could plausibly see it. And you can even make some good inferences about what minerals you're seeing, and in fact, how they are aligned relative to the overall kinematics that you know probably exist down there. So seismic anisotropy is really cool, and we should do it all the time wherever there are, you know, stations and seismic networks. But there's some stuff to think about that's really helpful and interesting. So first of all, rarely do you have a shear or any ductile structure that is monomineralic. And so there's always going to be different minerals that are all feeling the same stresses for the most part, and they're all going to be doing kind of their own things in terms of how they want to align. And they'll all be doing something that makes sense, but they might be aligning their fast directions and slow directions in ways that interfere with each other. And so that's something that's worth thinking about. And then there's another one too, which is probably way more familiar to people who work in sedimentary systems and oil and gas systems, which is the effect of layering. Layering all by itself, even made entirely of isotropic minerals, if there's a density contrast, can also contribute to anisotropy at like a meter or kilometer scale. And so that's something that you should think about too, because ductile deformation necessarily creates layers. As everything starts extending and smearing out, you always get this sort of like, these proto layers or full on meter thick layers forming, either gneissic or some other, everything just getting stretched in a particular direction. And so the polydeformed lower crust natural example that I'm going to show you here is actually a pretty good illustration of all of these different factors competing with each other. And so we're going to move forward with the lower crust example. And so this example is called the Coral Lake Shear Zone. And it's just this super well exposed, beautiful lower crustal shear zone that I studied for totally unrelated reasons. And this ended up being sort of a cool target of opportunity study that went along with it. So this, just as a quick orientation so you can feel bonded with this structure, it's located like 3 days north of Denver on a very exciting drive along closed logging roads when you're driving your own truck, way in northern Saskatchewan. And it's a fun place to do field work because there's a tiny little town right about here where you park your truck and then you get on a little float plane and it goes buzz, and it flies and it lands you on one of the many, many glacial lakes that have been eroded into the surface here because this whole area has been really nicely polished by ice sheets. And so it's a really great place to study all sorts of lower crustal stuff because this whole triangle that I'm showing you here is hundreds of square kilometers of pretty well exposed, glacially leveled isobaric lower crust. And so there's a couple of really cool shear zones in here that separate these different sort of lithotectonic domains. They don't really matter that much, except that this shear zone right here is what we studied for this that I'm going to show you here. And so if we zoom in on that little bit right here and have a closer look, now we're at the more of the single kilometer scale and not the tens of kilometers scale. This is essentially a good representation of the shear zone. The shear zone stretches for at least 90 kilometers, but usually it's around 4 to 6 kilometers wide, as we see here. And it has this, it's centered right on this boundary between like a really felsic domain to the northwest and a really sort of mafic feldspar-rich domain to the southeast. And it's about 1 GA, so it's long dead since it stopped deforming. And it's been clocked in at about 26 to like 36, 38 kilometers depth based on, petrology. And it was pretty hot when it was deforming, so 700, 800 degrees, which is great because the hotter you get, the more ductile everything gets. And so here's just some cool field photos that I couldn't resist showing in case you're not intimately familiar with what ductile structures look like. They're very squishy and they're very neat. And so here's sort of a meter scale example of the kilometer scale structure that I was talking about that I couldn't resist taking a photo of, where you have this nice sense of shear nicely illustrated by the offset of these layers. It also does a good job of illustrating how common layered structures are in these like high temperature ductile shear zones. And so here's another example of ductile deformation and shear where this big porphyroclast is being sort of stretched and degraded at the edges and turning into a long, thin layer as opposed to a big magmatic blob of a pyroxene or whatever that was. But this little guy right here is also really neat. And so if we zoom in here, but don't enhance, you can see what you have is an old feldspar grain that has this sort of grayish color and this much pinker new feldspar grain here. And it has the same sense of shear. And so it's worth looking closer at that one because I have a thin section image of an analogous crystal. And so here's like just a typical petrographic thin section, 30 microns thick, really nicely polished. And here you have an old K feldspar grain and all of the new little grains that are recrystallizing off of it. And so just in case you're not familiar with the term myelinite, this is the myelinitic process here where the bigger grain is sort of recrystallizing down into smaller and smaller, littler grains. And again, this is at like the millimeter scale. And so this is a nice illustration of how nicely ductile processes homogenize from the kilometer scale all the way down to the micron scale, because everything is feeling the same stresses in the same kinematic system. And so you can use micron scale information to inform kilometer scale interpretations. And so zooming way back out, give you some whiplash. this shear zone is more or less an ancient analog of the Altentag fault zone, but the way deep part of the Altentag. And that's not particularly relevant. It's just the best structure I could come up with for what this structure was at one point. So what do we even measure here? How do we get any of this data? So a lightning guide to all of this is that you need to use electron backscatter diffraction. And electron backscatter diffraction is basically the coolest technique in all of the Department of Geosciences, and I will fight anybody who wants to disagree with me on that, because it generates a huge volume of data that is just incredibly rich and fascinating in a very short period of time. And so the typical EBC data set is easily into the hundreds of thousands of individual measurements. They're almost always spatially gridded, and so you have spatial relationships at sub-micron scale if you want, up to millimeter scale if you want. And the way that you use this, and I'll go into a little more detail in a second about how you get EBSD and what the whole workflow is, because it's very visual and it's very cool. The reason why this EBSD is relevant, right, why you want to do this diffraction technique in situ on a polished sample, is because to get the seismic properties, you need to take the elastic properties of a perfect crystal in any orientation you want and align it with measured orientations of the minerals themselves in the real ductile structure. And so you have to be able to measure the orientation of the minerals in the ductile structure in order to apply the theoretical elastic tensor to that, and then homogenize all of that up and up and up to meter scale, to kilometer scale, et cetera. And there's two ways of applying these sorts of properties to these orientation measurements that you make that we'll go into in a little more detail as well in a second. One of which is the classic model, is that you simply say, I have this much quartz, I have this much feldspar, I have this much garnet, whatever. Here's the elastic properties, here how they're all kind of pointing. And then you basically do a calculation that is imagining as if the quartz were not in layers and that the garnet was not like a single big grain that you just mapped. And instead, it's like everything is extremely well mixed at the pixel scale, and also all the pixels are just squares. And then there's more advanced methods that have been getting some more traction lately that use much more advanced techniques to actually try and map and consider the microstructure of layers and the fact that grains have shapes, and that it's not quite going so far as to deal with the effect that grain boundaries have on seismic properties, which surely exists, but it does consider the fact that your quartz is all in a single layer, it's all pointing the same way, and not evenly distributed throughout the entire volume of your rock, which is not really feasible from a natural perspective. So EBSD, this is how it works. That tilted surface right there, that's your really well polished sample. And at our lab, we have a way of, we can walk you through the whole polishing setup. You do have to go like above and beyond the typical SEM microprobe level of polish, but it's automated, so it's pretty easy. And what you do is you have this electron beam from an SEM or microprobe or whatever you've mounted the system on come down at like a pretty steep angle, and it hits this really well polished surface of a crystalline material, and then all the electrons come out again in this diffraction pattern. And you have this EBSD camera, which is just a CCD camera with like a phosphor screen in front of it, scooted way up really close to your sample to get the best image it can of this diffraction pattern that's coming out of the sample surface there. And it just takes a photo of the diffraction pattern that it sees. And so the raw data here is really just hundreds of thousands of JPEGs or TIFF images that look like this sort of circular thing that you can see here on the screen. And this is a really cool technique because it's very, very surface, right? It's not like a micro XRD with a synchrotron or something like that, where there's like a bigger activation volume that you're sort of homogenizing with the signal. Instead, it's like very, very surface sensitive, which is why this polish really matters. And so you can rest assured that you're getting your signal, your diffraction signal, from just the very, very, very top of your sample, maybe usually in the 20 nanometer range. And so here's a cool little image that I stole from somebody else of, I think, probably copper or something like that, that shows how this works. And so the red cross that you see that's moving around there, that's the electron beam. And so the camera is sitting there, the sample is sitting there, and you move the electron beam around, and it focuses here, and it focuses there and there, and the diffraction pattern correspondingly shifts because the grain orientations are different. So the diffraction pattern has a different orientation. And so this is awesome because once you have the diffraction pattern, the software that you have paid oodles and oodles of money for has access to a vast library of different solutions based on perfect crystal systems of what that diffraction pattern is. Is it quartz pointing this way? Is it feldspar pointing that way? Is it, iron pointing that way? All that sort of stuff. It will figure that out to, half a degree of angular accuracy or better within like a tiny fraction of a second. And so the whole workflow of going from beam hitting sample to you now have a pixel in a data set that says this was quartz and it was pointing this way, it happens, at tens to hundreds of times per second, which is how you get these really, really cool, like huge million pixel maps that gives you just so much data to work with to make these sorts of calculations. And so here's our old friend, the potassium feldspar grain that I took, that's the cross-polarized thin section image. And then here is an EBSD map of the same thing. And so here with EBSD, in order to solve the diffraction pattern, it has to tell what crystal, like what mineral it is in the first place. So you get the orientations, and you also get like a pretty foolproof identification of what mineral that was in the first place. And so here everything is color coded by the mineral. And so most of it's purple. In this case, purple is orthoclase, K feldspar. And there's this sort of grayscale pattern there that matches up pretty nicely with the apparent grain boundaries that you can see here in the transmitted light section. And so that's really helpful because when the electron beam hits a grain boundary, the diffraction quality goes to nothing because you have two overlapping diffraction signals that it all just cancels out into like a gray wash. And so this is a really good technique for mapping grain boundaries in general, but it's also really good because you have all this orientation data. And so this is not human interpretable, but essentially all of these pixels have been color coded by the angular relationship of, I think in this case, the A-axis with some arbitrary sample direction, probably in this case, directly in and out of the screen. And so the different colors are showing you all the different ways in which that axis is misaligned to that sample specific direction. And so you get these beautiful maps capable of showing like less than a degree, a single degree of movement of like shift in the crystal structure's orientation between pixels in the way that you see like these sort of like beautiful sort of shading effects through here. And so this is the real power of the technique because this is how you do things like subgrains, deformation fabrics, like all of the stuff you can get from orientations. And so this map is about 500,000 measurements. And I think I got it in about 3 hours. Here's another way of looking at the same data. In this case, this is the amount of misorientation to the mean orientation of the grain that every pixel belongs to. And so it's a really cool way of showing like localized warping of the crystal lattice relative to like the grain itself. And as well as showing all of the little red boundaries are subgrain boundaries. And so you can define populations of grains, you can get grain size measurements, histograms, you can define everything you want about subgrain populations as well. This is the real value of EBSD. So that's what EBSD is. The way that you typically look at EBSD data is through a pole figure, because a pole figure is the two-dimensional representation of like a half hemisphere, like sort of scooping into the plane of the screen right here. And so if you imagine it's a bowl, it's a stereonet, basically, if anyone remembers being traumatized by that in structural geology. You take this sort of stereonet representation of all of these angles. And so in this case, what you're seeing here in this figure, again, this doesn't particularly matter, but this is the plane that this is showing. What it's mapping here in this pole figure is really bright colors are showing where there's a lot of orientations that all agree from this map right here. And so what this is showing you is that in this case, it's the pole to the plane, which means that the plane is like this, and the pole to the plane is the orthogonal line. They're all oriented basically like this in the screen. And so you have a bunch of planes for the O10 that are all doing this in this data set. And that makes a lot of sense because this crystal, this old crystal here is clearly recrystallizing. And the way that it's doing that is through defects, like the generation and reorganization of little defects in the crystal structure. And it makes perfect sense for one particular plane to become more oriented, more commonly oriented in a particular direction relative to the overall kinematics of the system, because those dislocations are going to use the lowest energy plane that they can to help break up this feldspar grain, basically, and create all of these new grains. And so this is a pole figure showing that you have a bunch of planes that are like this, essentially, going into the screen. And this is helpful because you can make the geological map and the EBSD data share the same reference frame. And so you don't have to keep doing these mental gymnastics of like rotating things in 3 dimensions to understand what this means in terms of like an overall shear zone. And so this shear zone is easy because it's basically straight up and down, and then it goes this way. And so you can take something like this, and this is the whole like, this is the dislocation structure and like why these planes align the way that they do. But you can establish a fairly simple geometric relationship where if this is a low energy plane, it's going to have this sort of like either parallel or slightly tilted geometry relative to the overall shear plane of the kilometer scale shear zone. And then there's going to be some particular crystal direction that's going to be like the elongation direction, essentially. And so you can always find these pairs of plane plus crystal direction defining a slip system that is really well oriented for the overall shear zone kinematics. And so then all you can do is just rotate those things a little bit, and now it's like you're looking straight down on the surface of the Earth, and it makes perfect sense that this is the primary orientation that you would imagine for feldspar grain deforming plastically in this shear zone. Makes perfect sense. So that's how you use the pole figures. And you'll see several of them, but other than understanding that the brighter colors means that there's more orientations in that, there's a higher density of orientations there, there's not much else to it. So the shear zone itself, right, now that we have a way of measuring stuff, it has a pretty simple structure. It's got lots of interesting stuff going on. The primary reason we studied it in the first place is because it gets super high strain towards the core, and it in fact generates, it has this like fascinating network of really high temperature, metamorphically overprinted frictional melts. So this was a seismically active 36 kilometer granulite facies shear zone at one point. But as far as this study is concerned, basically you have lower strain out away from this like dark boundary that you can see here, and then you have really high strain next to it. And that it's really deformed. So it's a good candidate for understanding seismic anisotropy. And so here's some examples then, right? So the top example is feldspar from a little farther away from like the center, the really high strain core. And you see that it has a particular set of orientations. It has sort of a flow stress that makes general tectonic sense. And then towards the core of the shear zone, the orientations sort of like diffuse a little bit. They're like not quite as sharply defined, but it's basically the same set of orientations. And then you can use the grain size to get at the flow stresses, and it's way higher. So it makes sense, right? Higher stresses, center of the shear zone, also helps explain the whole frictional melt thing. But that's a good representation of like what these crystals are up to in this shear zone. They all basically share an orientation, and it's like a pretty strong orientation too. And then here's some quartz. Here's a really cool photomicrograph of like a quartz grain inside a garnet being partially shielded from deformation. You can see it's recrystallizing as it heads on out into the rest of the matrix. And here again, you have a good illustration of the fact that although the optical textures, and so the way that it's recrystallizing is changing between the distant part of the shear zone and the core of the shear zone, you have a very similar sort of orientation pattern, where the C-axis, in this case, this right-hand thing, is basically oriented like this wherever you are in the shear zone. Although the A tends to sort of, again, it sort of diffuses a little bit when you get towards the center of the shear zone. And that might be a little relevant, and we'll talk about that a bit towards the end of the talk. But the point is, these crystals are pretty well aligned throughout the whole shear zone, and in a way that makes perfect sense with the deformation conditions and the overall kinematics of the shear zone. So that's good. That would suggest that this should have a pretty good seismic anisotropy, because all the quartz is going the same way, all the feldspar is going the same way. That's like 80% of the entire shear zone's volume is those two minerals, so this should be good. So then, let's embark on calculating the seismic anisotropy. So this is another hemispheric projection, but it's not a pole figure. What you're looking at here is straight down the C-axis of a perfect quartz grain, and these are the VPs. This is the speeds, basically, in kilometers per second of a perfect, like, theoretical quartz grain based on which way you're trying to go through the crystal structure. And so you can see from here that if you're looking straight down the C-axis, which is the 001 in the center, it's like generally a pretty fast direction, right? I mean, so those really blue, fast directions are not exactly the C-axis, but they're semi-parallel with it, whereas going in the opposite direction is going to be significantly slower, although still pretty fast compared to some things. So what you have here is the single crystal elastic properties of quartz. And so this is basically unoriented, right? It's like, well, depending on which way your c-axis is, this is where the fast and slow is going to be. And so what you do is you combine that single crystal elastic properties with actual orientations from a ductile structure. So in this case, most of our c-axes are doing this, although there's a little bit of a girdly thing going on. And then the other significant directions are just like this wash of like random noise in the orientations, which makes sense because the seismically important crystallographic directions might have nothing to do with the favorable slip directions and planes undergoing ductile deformation. But all you really do is you combine this oriented set of measurements that you've made of whatever mineral you want with the single crystal unoriented properties of that mineral, and you end up with a sort of a bulk result. Now that this is the lower figure here is what happens when you apply this single crystal property of quartz with all of these orientations, this volume that you measured of all these different quartz polycrystals going mostly the same direction, but a little bit not. This is the bulk property, the bulk seismic speeds of that quartz polycrystal that you measured here. And it's pretty intuitive, right? Because you can see that the c-axis is generally fast in the single crystal version. And then when you have a bunch of c-axes in a real rock that are basically going the same direction, you're going to end up with the bottom where the fast direction for the whole rock is basically the way that the c-axes were pointing in the quartz. And so this is like the most intuitive example I could find of how to sort of walk through that process. The problem is that in reality, minerals are much more complicated than quartz sometimes, and their interactions can be much more complicated as well. But this is the workflow. So the other half of just how much of this mineral do I have and which way is it pointing is the layering and the grain shapes. Because we're going to want to consider this if we can, both at the centimeter scale with all those little bandings, but also at the kilometer scale, because this whole thing is basically a banded structure, you know, that's just really, really big. And so we're going to look at one example here of this amorphosite, which is a really cool, really beautiful rock that is really stripy at like the meter scale. And so it doesn't matter what this is called, but it's a really cool rock. And when you look at this thing, here's a thin section of this rock, you can see the sort of dark band here is made of a bunch of mafic minerals, and then the lighter bands is just a bunch of feldspar. And so the way that you consider this, and like take into account the fact that this is a banded rock at this scale, is you make a totally digital schematic rendering by being very clever in Photoshop or some other sort of image processing tool. And you create these sort of domains where you're reasonably certain most of the microstructural, the orientation properties will be the same. So garnet, right? Garnet is isotropic, essentially. As long as you've like drawn all the garnet correctly, all that garnet's going to be behaving basically the same way. The same with like these dark zones is a blend of like pyroxenes and ilmenites, which you can find out by using EDS or an optical thin section or whatever you want. But you create these sort of like representative zones. And then you can assume that all of the feldspar is basically doing the same thing as well. It would be really nice if you had like a super cool microprobe like we have at DGS. You get some really good microtextures that way, and a really good way of identifying different compositional zones. But what you do is you make a bunch of measurements of these different sort of representative microstructural domains that you've outlined with your digital rendering. And you say, okay, well, I have a bunch of plagioclase, probably all pointing the same way. I have a bunch of CPX and OPX all together, that's the green stuff. So I'll take all of the measurements that I made of OPX on this sample, and I will sort of blend them together at the correct modal proportion for those minerals. And I'll give them sort of a tensor, you know, that represents the blend of those two things. In this case, it was a 4-to-1 ratio of clinopyroxene and orthopyroxene based on other sort of analyses that I did. And then you have garnet, which makes up about 17% of the total digital image right here. And it has almost no anisotropy, and so it doesn't really matter that much. And then you have magnetite and ilmenite as common reaction products here that are the really black stuff. And so what you do is you both weight all of these tensors that you've calculated from measurements that you've made within these domains by their modal proportion within this area. And so in this case, I wouldn't have actually collected EBSD from the entire image that you see here, because it's a full thin section. I would have gotten representative data from part of the green zone and part of the blue zone and part of the red zone, and then extrapolated that to be representative of everything else at the centimeter scale. And so that becomes sort of a tricky game of representative microstructure that you have to at least think about a little bit. So then what you do is you basically create a finite element mesh that does its best to tell where those microstructural domains are going to matter a lot and where they aren't, and to try and understand the level of homogeneity that they have and how that would impact the overall calculation for this whole image that you've given it based on those isotropic, or based on the elastic tensors that you gave it for green, red, blue, etc. And so what you can see is, let me just plug in my laptop again really quickly. What you can see is there's a pretty big difference of considering the microstructure versus not. And so the left-hand version considers microstructure, and the right-hand version just pretends that everything is just evenly mixed together based on the modal proportions that I gave it. And not surprisingly, perhaps, there is an increase in overall anisotropy based on considering the fact that there is this very strongly repeating layered structure within this thin section, which is pretty cool. So we can use that both at the thin section scale, but also at the kilometer scale. And we'll do that towards the end of this talk as well. So the overall shear zone as like a ductile structure in the earth, the way that we approach it is very similar to that sort of centimeter scale thin section, because we have essentially a digital schematic rendering of the distributions of these big, lithological units. And so our task is to collect EBSD from, micron to millimeter scale domains such that we are convinced that it is representative of the overall behavior of that lithology at the kilometer scale. And that's easier when you think about the fact that this is all a big shear zone, and that homogenizes lots of these textures, and it's actually not that much of a leap to go from centimeter scale to the kilometer scale. And so what you do is you take this digital image, just like we did with the thin section a second ago, and you input all of these representative tensors for the different lithological units, and how well you sort of managed to build that up and remain close to the truth is the trick of this analysis. But you put all of those things in, it calculates the different modal proportions of the yellow unit, the purple unit, the dark purple unit, all that stuff. It creates a finite element mesh to deal with the fact that the green unit is in these sort of like elongated blobs and not just scattered throughout the whole map area. And then in this case, what I did was I calculated it at different sort of zooming fields of view to see, which is a way of, what was it? It was different wavelengths of seismic wave, I think, will sample different volumes. And so I wanted to see, based on, I think, the frequencies that you use, whether or not to be more or less likely to see this structure. And so, again, you have an interesting comparison here, where as you sample a larger volume, the overall signal becomes more and more isotropic, because the two big units on either side of the shear zone are becoming a larger and larger portion of the volume you're sampling, and they're essentially isotropic because they're just these magmatic bodies. And so the overall signal sort of evolves as you zoom in and out, and you see, again, like an appreciable increase in seismic anisotropy by considering the layering, which I think is an important thing that the community that's doing this is definitely moving in, now that we have the ability to do it computationally. So here's a bewildering workflow diagram of exactly how you do this. And there's a lot of really cool, interesting discussions that I'd like to have with all of you at some point about the logic of upscaling. This project really made me think in a way that I haven't really been forced to as much, because you really are making this leap from these to claiming that it's representative, and as geology, we have to, right? Because we can really sample an entire field area. But it raises a lot of interesting questions about like exactly how you do this, because the uncertainty gets larger and larger and larger with every step that you make. But theoretically, because it's a ductile structure, you can make these leaps in a robust way. So, anyways, 2% anisotropy is not that much anisotropy. In fact, what it's basically saying is that this pretty significant ductile structure with a bunch of really well-aligned minerals is almost isotropic. And so how does that make any sense? Well, so one of the ways that makes sense is when you think about the way that rocks deform, they can undergo like a pretty significant step in their behavior in terms of their crystal orientations and how much they're straining. And so in general, when you look at this, larger grain sizes at lower temperatures, when they ductilely deform, they tend to produce really strong alignments. Because of the way the dislocations are moving through them, they recrystallize and they get these really good preferential orientation depending on which slip system they're using, which is, you know, a factor of, depends on strain rate, depends on the water content, it depends on lots of things, but there's lots of lab experiments on slip systems that makes this somewhat predictable. But the point is that under certain conditions, you'll get a really, really good, strong crystal alignment across the whole shear zone from this deformation. But sometimes you can sort of cross a particular line in terms of grain size and strain rate and temperature, and you'll use a completely different way, not completely different, but a pretty different way of deforming that's not so heavily reliant on dislocations moving through the crystal structure, and instead become reliant on surface processes with the little grains. And you tend to get more like grain-grain mixing, and so then they prevent each other from growing. And what you end up with is there's a way that you can be deforming at nearly the same temperature and nearly the same strain rate, and one rock will be producing like a really nice, strong preferred orientation. Another rock will give you total garbage orientations, because it's like right on this line of these deformation behaviors. And we've learned in the process of doing this that actually a lot of our rocks in this shear zone, especially near the core, are really close to this boundary between, you know, the diffusion creep that just annihilates your preferred orientation and the dislocation creep that creates a really nice orientation. So that's something that can automatically complicate, you know, your attempt to relate ductile deformation with seismic anisotropy, especially in the mantle. Oh yeah, and in this case, the core shear zone probably had some of this stuff going on. Like this is a pull figure in the bottom left from one of my rocks. So that's one thing that can sort of screw up your expectations. Another one is that when you have multiple minerals, they'll all deform according to like sensible, known, laboratory determined slip systems usually. They make total sense for the conditions and the kinematics, but will actively cancel each other out. So in this case, here you have the quartz orientations, which are all pointing this way. You end up with a nice, all the quartz is creating this sort of influence on the rock with a nice fast axis going in and out of the page. But my God, if you have any sillimanite in that same rock, which again is like not that remarkable, it's experiencing the same stresses, it's deforming alongside of the quartz, and it will produce a fast and slow set of orientations that is like orthogonal to the quartz. And so if there's enough sillimanite, it will cancel out the quartz, especially because the sillimanite is intrinsically more anisotropic as a crystal than the quartz is, as you can see from the BP bars to the right. So that's something that you have to worry about. And then I have a bunch more examples of this. It's actually extremely common in the lower crust, at least, that you have lots of really well-aligned minerals that make perfect sense that will totally fight with each other and basically create an isotropic rock once you're considering more than a few of these crystals at the same time. So lots of interference. Sometimes they amplify each other. That's kind of cool. Most of the time, though, they seem to just fight. And so here's sort of a simple diagram illustrating that, where for these minerals that are common in this shear zone, if the colors are overlapping, then based on the slip systems that they should be using under these conditions with this sort of sense of shear, they would amplify each other. And if they're not touching each other, then they cancel each other out to certain extents. So that's probably the problem why our shear zone with all of its really well-aligned minerals ends up not being that isotropic or not being that anisotropic, is because you have all these fighting slip systems, or these slip systems that produce fighting anisotropy. So it's kind of a cool observation. This gets way simpler if you're looking at like a much more simple sort of mantle shear zone, or if you're looking at like a really, really hydrous mid-crustal shear zone. But it's important to think about the fact that considering this laying is really important. And it's actually pretty easy to do as well. There's a total freeware program that will do all of this for you and makes for a much more rigorous study. So you should always think about the layering effects. And then, yeah, overall, this is like, technically, I think this would be visible depending on what was on top of it and in the whole path all the way to the surface, but it's really not that much, which is kind of cool too, because if you have a dry lower crustal shear zone underneath the Altan Tog or underneath, I don't know, the San Andreas, it's not very likely, but if it were there, it could be active and you wouldn't really be able to see it that clearly. And so in general, if you have a wet sort of mid-crustal shear zone like Vera had in her 2005 paper, you end up with these minerals like phyllosilicates that are just like hugely anisotropic and they all align really consistently. And they will basically overcome the competing influences from the other minerals. Or, you know, if you have a bunch of olivine, it's basically just olivine, then you get really much better behaved relationships between deformation conditions, slip systems, and seismic anisotropy. And so that is my talk. I'm gonna shut up now. And I don't know what happens now.
Thanks so much, that was awesome. So we can go ahead and take questions. Let's see. People can either raise their hands or just go ahead and shout them out. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask a question. When you're creating those schematic diagrams, how are you going about to do that?
Yeah, well, I made these, the ones that I used here for the thin section. That was a very aggressive use of Photoshop. And really the best way of doing it would be to collect like an EDS map of a whole thin section, because you can do that pretty quickly and pretty cheaply. And then you get a much more rigorous understanding of how to define your microzones, because you can define as many microzones as you want, really. And so if you're able to tell clinopyroxene from orthopyroxene, then it makes your extrapolation to the centimeter scale that much more rigorous. I mean, the most robust thing you could do is just EBSD map the entire thin section, but
right.
That's very time consuming. Yeah, X-ray maps would be the best thing to use, especially because if you take just like, manganese intensity and you sort of just select all the bright, strong signal from that, it's a pretty reliable indicator of like one particular sort of mineral. And so then when you collect your EBSD data, you basically just, you just hit like the garnets, for example. You pick 10 of them, you get single measurements from all of them. There's perfectly good reason to believe that that is 100% representative of garnet orientations in this rock, which should just be like, random, basically. It'd be cool if they weren't, but that's probably what they are. And then you do the same thing. Once you've looked at it, once you've sort of been like, okay, I've got a bunch of pyroxene. The pyroxenes all probably have similar orientations. All I need to do is be able to define how much pyroxene there is in this thin section, and then collect some representative orientation data for that. And then you can extrapolate that to all of the pyroxenes that you can define digitally somehow.
Got it.
Yeah.
Cool. Looks like we have a question from Brandon.
Hey, Phil, that was an awesome talk. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, are you seeing a lot of consistency with anisotropic properties of minerals, even at the scale of within a particular shear zone, or like comparing, the shear zone here in Canada to, like you said, maybe one over in the Himalayas? I guess I'm asking because I'm looking at seismic anisotropy in the upper mantle and ocean basin, and it's a place where unfortunately we'll probably never get any samples from because it's buried under about 12 kilometers of sediment. So I'm wondering, what should I do? Should I assume some sort of properties from a similar tectonic environment elsewhere and try and scale those to my particular setting? Or do you see so much variability that you think that's not a reliable thing to do?
Hey, Brandon, nice to meet you. Also, I really like your poster in the background. I haven't worked that much with mantle rocks, but I did a quick summary during my PhD and a little bit leading up to this as well, because I figured that's probably a little more interesting to most folks here. And it seems like mantle shear is much easier to make inferences about, in that there's a bunch of like pretty well-known, well-established slip systems. Like that earlier one, there's like the A, the B, the E, the D, like all that sort of stuff. And they have like a pretty simple relationship with fast and slow directions. If you assume mineral homogeneity, which I'm not really sure if that's a safe assumption to make, safer than in the crust, I'm sure, for sure. But like, if it's just 100% olivine, what would that signal look like? And would this sort of fabric explain it? Or would this sort of fabric explain it? And how would you have to maneuver it, like rotate it, right, to discover some kinematic orientation of one of these slip systems that would explain the signal that you are seeing, right? Because you have a signal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that'd be a really interesting exercise because you can also look at, Vera did this a lot, just the basic symmetry of the anisotropy that you are seeing can tell you a lot about which mineral is contributing the most and which subsystem it's using, regardless of the actual orientations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are things that I'm starting to look into, but yeah, I'd like to discuss that further with you.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Awesome.
Looks like we also have a question from Ian and then Thomas.
Yeah, Phil, that was a really interesting talk. Thank you. It made me realize how much time I wasted as a graduate student measuring quartz C-axes on a universal stage, one by one. I was interested in the garnets. I worked on deformed garnets along the Grenville Front Shear Zone in Ontario a long time ago. Are these pre-tectonic garnets, pre-magnetization garnets that are? And do they have a shape deformation?
They are pre-tectonic. In this case, the structure we're studying is a D3 for this region, and the garnets grew, I think, before D2 easily. D1 is not that well understood, but these garnets are definitely deformed. And one of the things that we're working on with Liz Kapos as well is collecting the sort of EBSD data just of the garnets, not for seismic anisotropy, but to look at the deformation structures within them. And doing dislocation maps, dislocation density maps, is a cool new thing that you can do with EBSD, thanks to this very, very smart German who has been working on the coding for this. But we find that the garnets are both shattered and bookended in some cases. I don't think I have a good example. But frequently they are a little sort of rotated and stretched as well.
Okay. Yeah, we did some Larry X-ray studies of the internal structure, and you could see the bending of the axes at right angles to the stretching direction in the shear zone.
Oh,
Very
cool.
interesting. Yeah, that was an interesting talk. Thank you.
Well, when I have my EBSD data from my first set of garnets from these rocks, can I show it to you?
Sure, I'd love to see that.
Oh, thank you.
Drop by sometime.
I will.
Awesome. Looks like we also have a question from Thomas.
Hey, good talk. Not that I understood a lot of it. There is one question though, is there's definitely a frequency response difference between your small scale and your large scale. What is the frequencies you're using around slide 4 when you're looking just at the grains?
Slide 4.
4, you were just headed up.
Oh, okay. Slide 4. This slide?
Yeah, what's the frequency you're measuring the deeps at be?
That is a good question. I do not know the answer.
It'd have to be high enough so it would be within the grain. So it'd probably be ultrasonic.
Oh, are you asking how you get the single crystal properties in the first place?
Right, did you derive that VCP? Or?
Oh, yes. I definitely stand on the shoulders of giants that have Brion scattering, I think is the word that I see the most to describe how they did these single crystal elasticity measurements. But there's a ton of published data on feldspars at different points in solid solution series, on olivines. They do all suffer from the fact that they are made at room temperature and pressure, which is certainly not representative of what these minerals what the properties of these minerals would be at depth, and certainly not while deforming, while riddled with dislocations. So that's sort of an uncertainty that gets mixed in with all of this.
Yeah. Well, I hope this talk is being recorded because I know a few other people who would like to see this.
Well,
It is.
I'm always happy.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Phil. This was a really enjoyable talk.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here.
Excellent. All right, I'll talk to you later.
All right,
Bye, everyone.
have
See
a
you
good
next week.
afternoon.